Let us start with demand for loanable funds. This comes from three fields, that is investment, consumption and holding. Now what do you mean by investment? The bulk of demand for loanable funds comes from business firms which borrow money for purchasing or making new capital goods, including the building up of inventories. The price of the loanable funds required to purchase the capital goods is the rate of interest. The demand for loanable funds for investment purposes is interest elastic and slopes downward to the right. Consumption. Demand for loanable funds comes from individual or households who want to borrow for consumption purposes. Loans for consumption are demanded for buying durable goods like automobiles, refrigerators, etc. Demand for loanable funds for consumption purposes is interest elastic and slopes downwards to the right. Holding. Demand for loanable funds may come from from those who want to hold money, to hold savings as idle cash balances. The demand for holding money is the interest elastic and slopes downward to the right at higher rates of interest. People will hold less money and vice versa. So for loanable funds, firstly it is investment. Investment is used for bulk demand or for giving loan to different investors. Then next is consumption. Consumption means the demand for loanable funds which comes from individual or households or who want to borrow money for consumption. Holding means people who save their money and to hold savings and idle cash balances. Now, equilibrium between demand for and supply for loanable funds. The rate of interest will be determined by the equilibrium between the total demand for loanable funds and total supply of loanable funds. This can be illustrated as follows. In the above figure 4.19, LS is the total supply curve. Total supply curve for loanable funds derived by the lateral summation of disorderly DH, disinvestment DI, savings S and bank credit BM. The total demand for loanable funds is LD derived by the lateral addition of holding, consumption C and investment I. LD and LS interest and rate of interest or where ON amount is of loanable funds is borrowed, demanded and lent supplied. So this is the curve of interest and loanable funds, in which we can understand about the disholding, about disinvestment and savings and bank credit. Now let us understand about liquidity preference theory of interest. This is one of the most important theories of interest advocated by J.M. Keynes in his book The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. He defines the rate of interest as the reward for parting with liquidity during a specified period. It is the price which equates the desire to hold wealth in the form of cash with the available quantity of cash. In other words, the rate of interest in the Keynesian sense is determined by the demand for and supply of money. Demand for money. Keynes called the demand for money as liquidity preference. This refers to the desire to hold cash. According to Keynes, the desire for liquidity arises out of three motives. First is the transactions motive. This relates to the need for cash for current transaction, that is for day-to-day requirements. The need for holding cash to meet the day-to-day requirements arises because of the interval between the receipts of income and expenditure. That is, income is received at the beginning of the month, while expenditure is spread out over the month. Hence, the need for liquidity arises to bridge this gap between income and expenditure. The amount of liquid cash held for transactions is mainly dependent upon the level of income. The amount of money held under transactions motive is denoted by the letter M1. Precautionary motive. This refers to the desire of the people to hold cash balances to meet unforeseen contingencies. That is, both individuals and businessmen keep some cash in reserve to meet the unexpected needs such as illness, accidents, unemployment, etc. The amount of money held under this motive will be also depend upon the level of income. It is also conditioned by the nature of the individual and his view of life. Money held under precautionary motive is denoted by the letter M2. Therefore, the amount of money held under transactions motive 1 M1 and under the precautionary motive M2 depends upon the level of income Y. So M1 plus M2 is equal to Y. So now what do we understand? First is transaction motive. Now what do you mean by transaction motive? This cash is required for day-to-day transactions or fulfilling day-to-day requirements of the business and for holding cash to meet day-to-day needs of the businessman as well as individual. Then precautionary motive. Now what is this precautionary motive? Businessman or individuals, what they do is they keep certain cash for unforeseen contingencies. That is, in case any problem arises in future, they keep certain money for that. So this is precautionary motive. Now next we have speculative motive. Money held under the speculative motive is for securing profit by taking advantage of changes in the bond prices and rate of interest. Individual and businessmen having surplus funds after keeping enough for transactions and precautionary motives like to gain by investing in bonds, buying at low prices and selling at high prices. The amount of money held under speculative motive depends on the rate of interest. Bond prices and the rate of interest are inversely related to each other. A bond carries a fixed rate of interest. Suppose, for instance, a bond of the value of rupees 100 carries 4% interest. If the market rate of interest to 5%, the demand for this bond falls in the market with a consequent fall in price. On the other hand, if the market rate of interest falls to 3%, the demand for this bond rises with a consequent rise in its price. Low bond prices are indicative of high interest rates and high bond prices reflect low interest rates. Thus, the speculative demand for money will be less at a high rate of interest because high rate of interest reflect low bond prices, and it is possible that some of the businessmen convert their cash into bonds, leaving less liquidity in their hands. On the other hand, if the interest rate is low, reflecting high bond prices, businessmen sell their bonds with the result that the liquidity in their hands is high. Therefore, high the rate of interest, lower the speculative demand for money, and lower the rate of interest, higher is the speculative demand for money. The speculative demand for money is denoted by letter M3. Since M3 depends upon the rate of interest or bond prices, the speculative demand function is written as M3 is equal to function of R. If the total demand for money liquidity is denoted by M, then M is equal to M1 plus M2 plus M3. M1 plus M2 is equal to F in the function of Y. M3 is equal to function of R. M is equal to function of Y and R. So what does this mean? Speculative motive. Speculative motive means when people take advantage of shares by investing in bonds or investing at low prices and getting higher returns. So a bond carries a great value for that, and the speculative market, this is a speculative market, means what? That the conditions shall prevail or there shall be changes in the conditions. Sometimes it shall rise, sometimes it shall fall. So this is called as speculative motive. Now this is the curve. The speculative demand for money can be illustrated as follows. In the figure 4.20, LP indicates the liquidity preference for speculation. Speculative demand for money at interest rate of OR2. The speculative demand for money is as small as OM1 and at a lower interest rate or OR1. Speculative demand for money extends to owing to Keynes holds that the speculative demand curve becomes perfectly elastic at a certain low rate of interest. At this low rate of interest, people prefer to keep money in cash. This position of liquidity preference curve is called the liquidity trap. Supply of money. This refers to the total quantity of money in the country for all purposes at any time. According to Keynes, the supply of money is fixed by the monetary authorities. That is, the supply curve of money is taken to be perfectly inelastic. This is depicted as follows. The rate of interest, supply of money. In the above figure 4.21, SS is the perfectly inelastic supply curve of money. Determination of the interest of the rate of interest. The rate of interest, like the price of any product or service, is determined by the demand, liquidity preference and supply of money. In fact, it is the liquidity preference for speculative motive along with the quantity of money that determines the rate of interest. This is depicted as follows. In the figure 4.22, SS indicates the inelastic supply curve of money and the curve LB indicates the liquidity preference for speculative money. They intersect at E and the equilibrium rate of interest OR is determined. At this rate of interest, the demand for money equals supply of money OS. Now next we have changes in demand for money. With the supply remaining constant, any changes in the liquidity preference tends to alter the rate of interest. When the liquidity preference curve shifts to the right or upwards from LP1 to LP2 because of an increase in the level of income, the rate of interest rises from OR1 to OR2. This is illustrated as follows. In the above figure 4.22, the equilibrium point shifts from E1 to E2. Changes in supply of money. With liquidity preference of the consumers remaining constant, an increase in the supply of money by the monetary authorities from S1 to S2 leads to a decline in the rate of interest for OR1 or OR2. This can be illustrated as follows. So from this figure we can understand that how it is going on declining or how it goes, the rate of interest and demand for money keeps on changes. In the above figure 4.24, the equilibrium shifts from E1 to E2. Thus, in the Keynesian theory of interest is a purely monetary phenomenon determined by the demand for money and the supply of money. Now next we have profit. Now what do you mean by profit? Profit is the reward owed to the entrepreneur for his entrepreneurial functions among the four factors of production. The entrepreneur occupies a unique place. He is unique in the sense that unlike the other factors of production, he cannot be hired for if he is hired, he becomes a part of labor. It is this quality which keeps his position strategic in the mechanism of production. Profit as a residual income. Profits are residual income left after the payment of the contractual rewards to the other factors of production. While employing factors of production, the entrepreneur enters into a contract with them. He pays rent on the land used, wages to workers employed, and interest at rates fixed by the contract on the loans taken. Actually, the entrepreneur makes a payment to these factors of production even after he has realized the value of the product produced through sale of the product. The profit of the entrepreneur is nothing but what is left after paying the contractual rewards to the factors of production. Thus, profits are non-contractual income and therefore they may be positive or negative, whereas contractual income of other factors of production such as rent, wages and interest are always positive and are never negative. Profit differs from the return on the other factors in three important respects. So as we know, profits is the residual income. Residual income means what? The leftover income after payment of all all the other factors of production. Profit is a residual income and not contractual or certain income as in the case of other factors. There are much greater fluctuations in profits than in the rewards of the other factors. Profits may be negative loss when TR is smaller than TC, whereas rent, wages and interest must always be positive. In the accounting sense, profit is TR minus TC, but TC includes only explicit costs, contractual payments like wages, rent, interest, raw material cost, on fuel, depreciation charges, etc. In economics, also profit is TR minus TC, but TC includes explicit as well as implicit costs such as imputed costs of a firm's own capital, land, entrepreneur's salary for his managerial skill. Profit is a surplus of firm's TR over TC, which includes explicit and implicit costs. Profit is a return for the entrepreneurial ability. Normal profit is a part of the cost of production. Therefore, in economics, normal profit is not true profit. Economic profit is TR minus TC. Explicit and implicit costs, including normal profit. Further, as mentioned above, profit being a residual income can be negative or loss. Gross profit and net profit. Now let us understand about gross profit and net profit. Gross profit stands for the total earnings of the entrepreneur, not necessarily for the entrepreneurial functions only. It is composed of the following elements: imputed costs of maintenance or depreciation charges, land, labor, and capital may be owned and supplied by the entrepreneur himself. Hence, the implicit rent, implicit wages, and implicit interest are included in gross profit. The imputed minimum return for the entrepreneur's organizational function, that is, the return for the work done by the entrepreneur as manager and could have been done by him on a salary basis for another firm, are also called normal profits and is included in gross profit. Monopoly gains, which are due to imperfect competition, also form part of gross profits. Conjectural gains, also called windfall gains, which may be due to favorable circumstances or pure luck, also form part of gross profit. Profit or pure net profit or pure economic profit earned by the entrepreneur for his function of risk taker, both insurable and non-insurable, and efficiency form part of gross profit. Net profit or pure profit. Net profit is the income from risk taking, that it is a payment made exclusively for bearing risk. This essential function of the entrepreneur cannot be the task of management. It is the entrepreneur who assumes the final responsibility that cannot be shifted on to anyone else. Thus, net profit is the gross profit minus the first 5 elements of gross profit mentioned above, such as imputed cost of maintenance or depreciation charges, implicit rent, implicit wages, implicit interest, normal profits, monopoly gains, and conjectural gains. Theories of profit. The risk-bearing theory of profits. The risk-bearing theory of profits is associated with associated with every Hollywood. According to him, all businesses are more or less speculative, and unless the risk taker is amply rewarded, business will not be started. The greater the risk, the higher must be the expected profit in order to induce people to start business. If there is no hope for substantial profit, no one will be willing to risk money by investing it in your business. Hawley explained 4 types of risks which are undertaken by the entrepreneur. Replacement is also called depreciation. It can be calculated. It is added into the cost. Obsolescence, it is not measurable because it is always possible. It is not always possible to anticipate technical progress. Risk proper, it is the risk of marketability of the product. Uncertainty is with regard to unforeseen factors. Entrepreneurs bear all the risk in the hope of earning profits. Hence, profits can be called as costs of staying in businesses. So this was the theory which was given by F.B. Hawley. Yeah, and in which he stated that we cannot state that what will be the losses or how much profit a business shall earn. Now, what was the criticism for his theory? This theory has been criticized on the ground that though profits do contain some remuneration for risk taking, yet the high profits made by entrepreneurs cannot in their entirety be attributed to the element of risk. Profit is a mixed income. They arise not only due to risk taking but also from the ability, managerial and bargaining powers of the entrepreneur. Some critics point out that profits arise not because risks are borne by the entrepreneurs but because the superior entrepreneurs are able to reduce them. Professor Knight pointed out that profits arise not due to all risks. Some risks can be foreseen and they can be insured and hence they can be covered. Profits occur due to only those risks which are unforeseen, unpredictable and not insurable. It is wrong to believe that there is a proportionate relationship between risks and profits as was believed by Hawley. In reality, risks and profits are not rigidly related to each other. Thus, Hawley's risk-bearing theory of profits is incomplete. Professor Knight's uncertainty-bearing theory of profits. Professor F.H. Knight made an improvement over the risk-bearing theory and presented a refined version called the uncertainty-bearing theory of profits. He has attributed the origin of profits to risks and uncertainty-bearing. According to him, risks are of two kinds. Risk can be insured, that is, risks which are measurable and whose possibility can be statistically measured. The risks of fire, theft and accidents are insurable and they are usually borne by the insurance companies. Hence, insurable risks are not the real risk attributed to entrepreneurial function. Risks that cannot be insured against. There are certain risks which are incalculable and whose probability cannot be computed because of the presence of uncertainty. Such unforeseen risks relate to changes in prices, demand, supply, etc. No insurance company can calculate the loss expected from such risks and hence they are non-insurable. These risks have to be borne by the entrepreneur himself. According to Professor Knight, profit is the reward for bearing non-insurable risks or uncertainties. The uncertainties of the business which are non-insurable include demand fluctuations which can occur due to change in income, tastes and fashion. Technological changes takes place very rapidly, changes in government policies, cyclical fluctuations, political instability, secular changes in the form of unforeseen changes in income, taste, size and composition of population, etc. Whenever a new product comes into the market, the entrepreneur has to decide whether the product will be approved by the customers, whether the price is high or low, and has to determine the advertisement outlook. If his calculations and judgments are correct, they make profits, and if they go wrong, they incur losses. Therefore, according to Knight, it is the non-insurable risks that involve uncertainty and give rise to profits. So, from this we can understand that the profits which a firm shall earn or a business shall earn are uncertain and they shall depend upon the outside conditions like demand and fluctuations for the product, then technical changes, then changes in government policy, cyclical fluctuation, then political instability, then other changes in the population composition, taste, income and everything. So let us understand about the criticism now. Uncertainty is not the only factor that limits the supply of entrepreneurs. Lack of funds, lack of knowledge, lack of opportunities, and the presence of economic friction are some of the other factors that restrict the supply of entrepreneurs. Uncertainty bearing is not the only function of the entrepreneur. The profit that he gets is also the reward for the other services that he renders. Example, initiating, coordinating, etc. Uncertainty bearing cannot be evaluated to the status of a factor of production. It is an element of real cost, which means exertion, absistence, sacrifice, etc., as distinguished from money cost. Cost is not generally measured in terms of real cost. We know that the capital is a factor of production, but absistence is also needed to have capital. And Knight's theory does not have much relevance to the real world. Businessmen continue to estimate profits ex and indefiniteness of this theory. In modern times, the entrepreneurial function is divided among shareholders, directors, and managers of the company. It is not clear in this theory as to who bears uncertainty. Thus, Knight's uncertainty bearing theory of profits has been criticized as heavily insulated from empirical testing and empirical relevance. Now let us understand the next theory, that is dynamic theory of profits. This theory is associated with the name of American economist J.B. Clark. Profits arise as a result of dynamic changes in the economy. According to Clark, profit is the difference between selling price and cost which emerges because of changes in demand and supply conditions. In a static world, statutory conditions of demand and supply, where the size of population, the amount of capital, the quantity and the quality of human works, the methods of production, technical knowledge, the organization of business, etc., remain constant. There is no real or pure profit. Hence, under competitive conditions, price equals AC, and there is no surplus and no pure profit. Wherever there is a temporary surplus, production will increase, bringing down the price, and the surplus disappears. But the real world is a dynamic world where changes are constantly taking place. There are internal changes which the entrepreneur himself brings about, such as innovations, technological improvements, changes in the form of business organization, and external changes such as changes in the taste and preferences, increase in population, etc. These changes make the economy dynamic and bring about changes in the demand and supply conditions. Some entrepreneurs attain advantageous business positions and reap a surplus over cost and earn profits. Thus, efficient entrepreneurs get profits while inefficient entrepreneurs fail to keep pace with the dynamic changes, do not earn any profit, and may even incur a loss. Criticism. The theory explains the difference between profits and wages, but it does not distinguish between wages of an entrepreneur and his profit. It fails to determine the size of profits. The theory ignores the profit as a reward for risk taking. The risk element cannot be ignored while determining profits. The theory gives an inadequate explanation of the dynamic society. It explains only a few components of a dynamic society. It is incorrect to say that profits arise only due to changes incurring in society. Profit is also earned due to the ability, organizational and managerial skill of the entrepreneur. Thus, the dynamic theory of profit provides a poor explanation of the origin and nature of profits. The innovation theory of profits. This theory was put forth by Joseph Schumpeter. According to him, the main function of the entrepreneur is to introduce innovations in the economy, and profits are a reward for this function. Schumpeter emphasized this function of the entrepreneur to distinguish him from the bureaucratic executive or the manager who simply runs an established business in a steady manner. Invention may be made by a technician or an engineer. But when this technical invention is put to commercial use, it becomes an innovation. An innovator is a businessman with vision and originality and dares to undertake high risks involved in a new business. Innovations are of two types: product innovations and market innovation. Product innovations, those which reduce the cost of production of an enterprise. These include introduction of a new machinery, new and cheaper technique or process of production, exploitation of a new source of raw material, a new and a better method of organizing the firm, etc. All these affect the cost and quality of the product. Market innovations, those which increase the demand for his product. These include introduction of a new product of a new variety or design of the product, a new chapter and a superior method of advertisement, discovery of new markets, etc. All these influence the market demand for the firm's products. If an innovation proves successful, that is, if it achieves its aim of neither reducing the cost of production or enhancing the demand for the product, it will give rise to profit. Profits emerge due to successful innovation because either cost falls down the prevailing market price of the product or the entrepreneur is able to sell more at a better market price than before. This is described as innovational profit. Profits caused by a particular innovation are only temporary and tend to be competed only as others imitate and also adopt it. When an entrepreneur introduces a new innovation, he is the first in a monopoly position. Further, new innovation is confined to him only. Therefore, he makes large profits when after some time others also adopt it in order to get a share. Profits will disappear. But a successful innovator may search for another innovation and again he tends to earn innovational profit. In this way, innovational profits appear and disappear. Therefore, these innovational profits exist continuously in a modern progressive business. Criticism. Scampeter's innovation theory can be criticized on the same ground as Clark's dynamic theory. Scampeter, also like Clark, ignores uncertainty as a source of profit. He also denies that risk bearing plays any role in the determination of the profits. Critics point out that Scampeter's theory explains nothing about windfall or monopoly profits. Such profits do not result from the introduction of innovation. The theory has been considered unsatisfactory due to its explanation of profits as of a temporary nature. Profits are neither temporary nor wiped out after a short time. Profits remain for a long time. In fact, if profits are wiped out, soon no entrepreneur will stick to their production process. In short, innovation theory of profits is not a satisfactory and a complete theory of profit. Whenever it points out a very important function of the entrepreneur which generates profit. So this was about the innovation theory which was given by Joseph Scampeter, and in which he says that product innovation, market innovation will lead to maximum profits to the business entrepreneur. His criticisms are similar to the criticisms which were given by J.B. Clark. So with this we come to the end of this chapter.